Okay, so
good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So we'll be really pleased that Ronald Black is speaking tonight. Ronald was born and brought up in Glasgow. He had plenty of European languages in his family on his mother's side. He used to hear Gaelic spoken by nurses and policemen on the streets and in the trams, and he came to understand that it was the country's old language. So he then grew angry that it was not taught at his school, and when he got the chance to learn it in another school, he seized the opportunity with both hands. He became a lecturer in Gaelic in Glasgow University and then in Edinburgh University. He's now retired. He has written or edited many books about Gaelic literature and folklore and history of the Gaeltacht. He's the director of the Dewar project, which is tackling John Dewar's manuscripts, transcribing them, translating them into English, and publishing them, starting this year with John Dewar's Isla, Dewar and Colonsay, co-edited by Christopher Drakeup. So that's it. Ronnie, thanks very much, Alison. Your Gaelic's good. I'm really happy to be here. It's good to be in the house, to be at home. It's nice to meet you all. And to talk about this man, my favourite person in the world at the moment, Ian MacGill, John Dewar. He was from Arrochar, the Loch Long side. He was born in 1802 and he died in 1872. And he spent the years between 1860 and 1872 travelling around Argyll and other parts of the Gaeltacht, listening to historical stories and writing them down in Gaelic. So the fruits of his labour are 10 manuscripts in which there are the history of the people from about 1308 to 1752, told in their own language. 7 of them are in Inveraray and 3 in Edinburgh, with well over 4,000 pages of writing. The work's going on at the moment as a cooperative project with the intention of taking out a series of books. Now, there's a technical hitch, I think, for moving on the slides. He's doing his best. He's trying to move on. Ah, there we are. So, here we are. So there are 14 tales about Tiree. I'm going to tell you something about each one of them, starting with the words that Dewar has and finishing them in my own words. I'm going to relate them in historical order, chronological order, as you can see in this list, starting with a tale from the time of the Lords of the Isles, moving through the MacLean age and to the Campbell age, and finishing shortly after 1745. So I'm not going to read out the list here because we're going to look at them individually after this. So Dewar doesn't have anything at all about the potato famine, when the potato failed, or the drowning of Balafoyle, or the land troubles. So we have to remember that he was in Tiree before there was any word of the Land League, and also it was the Duke of Argyll that was paying him, and that Ian Och Ile, John Francis Campbell of Isla, was scrutinising every word that he wrote. So it was better for him to stop writing when it came to contemporary affairs. But Dewar wrote other stuff as well that belongs to the island. Rental, Oceanic Lay, and the names of some of the people that gave him the stories, apparently. And we'll have a look at this information again. And there are writings from Tiree in the manuscripts that aren't in Dewar's own hand. I won't have time to look at them, so I'll just read out that list. There's a song, The Princess's Welcome to the Highlands, 1871, by the Reverend Gaelic Farquharson, minister of the Independent congregation of Tiree. It was printed and with opinions from Ian O'Keefe about it. The song "Welcome the Princess's Welcome to Inveraray Castle," again printed, again by Farquharson. The song "Brachgan Mariushin" by John Maclean, the poet of Ballavarton, Mariushin's Tartan. The Song of the Tea, also by the same poet, Bart Ballavarton, in an anonymous hand. And Traditions About the Island of Tiree in English, again by an unknown hand. So you can see M instead of D to this final, that last reference. Now that means that it's not in Dewar's manuscripts, but in the ones that Hector Maclean, who translated Dewar's stories for the Laird of Lorne between 1879 and 1881. The translation's pretty rough and ready, and it's quite old-fashioned, but I'll do just now. It's in the archive in Inveraray, along with the rest. I'll show you a little of the traditions about the island of Tiree in the middle of the talk. To begin with then, a story that belongs to the time of the MacDonalds, that's the Lords of the Isles. Immediately we see some of the difficulties that's involved in Dewar's manuscripts. His hand's good, but the spelling and the punctuation is all over the place. He uses shorthand now and again, such as V instead of MH or BH, which you would get in Gaelic. There are two examples of that to be seen here. There's the word laven, meaning hands, and skrivje, written. Also, Dewar's not very good with place names. Sometimes he leaves a gap where there should be a place name. And that happens at the very beginning of this tale. So you should know a few things about Dewar to begin with. He never went to school, but it's obvious that he went to church because his writing is full of Gaelic Bible spelling, such as ear instead of AIR and she instead of a for he. He learned to write and to read both in Gaelic and English by himself. And he was a storyteller himself with a fantastic memory. So he would listen to a story, he would remember it, he'd go back to his lodgings, he'd write it down, he'd go back then to the storyteller, he'd read out what he'd written, and he would make a note of any changes. But as you notice, maybe it's in these two manuscripts that we call D6 and D7 that most of the Tiree stories are. Now they're just pocket books, quickly written without a lot of care. There are no Tiree stories appearing in the main manuscripts, D1 to D5, that were written out carefully after he'd gone home, apparently. So I understand at this stage anyway, that it's shortly before his death that he was in Tiree, around about 1870. Maybe he was in a hurry, but he never filled in the gaps you can see at the beginning of the page. So if we fill it from out of our own imagination, we can read the story like this: Island of Tiree. A brother of MacLean of Dewar married a daughter of MacDonald, and they lived in Finlagan in Islay. And once MacDonald went to see his daughter, and he was in our house all night, and MacLean ordered his wife not to give her father a towel the next day. And he asked her to say to him that the reason that they didn't have a towel was there was no soil, land to grow the flax to make it. So the next day, when MacDonald got up for his breakfast, there was no towel on the table, and he asked for a cloth to clean his hands, and his daughter said, "Well, I don't have a towel." And MacDonald said, "Oh, girl, this house is pretty bare. How can you be without a towel?" And she said, "Well, flax won't grow in this soil that you've given us here, but there's a little island behind Mull that they call Tiree. Now, some say that flax will grow well there, and if I could get that little island, the flax would grow well there, and I would never be without towels after that." So MacDonald promised his daughter, and a little while after that, he gave her a written right to MacLean over Tiree. And after MacDonald had gone, MacLean said, I've got the rights to it now, and I'll have Tiree, regardless of the old man. So MacLean went to Tiree and he built a castle there. Now, MacLean and the tenantry. When MacLean was erecting a house in Lochanelan in Tiree, he did it with compulsory labour, Morlanach. And it was from Balafetrish that they quarried the stone, and it was with creels on pack saddles on horseback that they carried the stone for the house. So one day there was a farmer who was living in Ballymeenach, and he was late coming, and every one of the others gave him a stone each from the creels, and he went with the load along with the rest. But when he let down the stones, MacLean went over and he grabbed the halter of the man that was late, or the horse, and he said, "I saw what you did, and you away and bring me a proper load." So this fella went to Balafetrish and he took the load, and he said, "I took my load here, but you won't eat 3 meals in the house when it's finished." Now, the same tale was told about the Campbell of Baranacarrig, the factor that built the new Tynelin afresh in 1748, and we'll meet him later on in the talk. But here's a story about the first Campbell that was in Tiree. He was a joiner, and his name was Fionlug Goinioch, Fionlug O'Doine Finlay Campbell, as they would say today. And it's a trickster's tale, the sort of tale. So Finlay's full of humorous talk and tricks, and he always gets his own way. So the story also shows us how well the relationship was between MacLean of Dewar and MacLeod of Dunvegan. Fionlug Goinioch. There was a joiner that they called Finlay Goineach, living in Ballavart in Tiree. And he was the only joiner in the 5 islands. That's Mull, Iona, Ullava, Coll, and Tiree. And MacLeod of Dunvegan needed a joiner to put his castle in order. And he went to Tiree to see if he could get a joiner from Maclean. MacLeod reached Tiree and he called on Maclean. Now at this stage, Dewar is guiding us to where he wrote first on the opposite page. Now, they met Finlay down in the market, and MacLeod shook Finlay by his hand and he asked him, "How are you, Finlay?" "And you've gone back and you're walking." Finlay said, "I've got more walking and more vision today than I ever had before." And MacLeod said, "How can that be? The people in my tenants, they always go back when they get old." Finlay said, "MacLeod," he says, "I was when I was young, when I'd come to a ford in a river, I'd jump across, but now when I come to a ford, I have to walk through it. And is there not more walking there? And before, when somebody'd come on the horizon into view, I'd only see one. But now when somebody comes into sight, I see 3. Is that not more vision?" So MacLeod said, "Let's go to the hotel, the inn, and we'll get a dram." So now it goes back over to where the word, the letter 2 is in the first page. So the 2 gentlemen went to the inn at Gatchin. Gatchin, it's called in Gaelic, but Ronald thinks it's maybe Gorston Dall's the name of the place. Maybe you'll know. So MacLeod asked for a bottle of whiskey, and he filled a quaich, and he drank Maclean's health, saying, "A favour from you, Maclean." And Maclean said, "You're welcome, with a gift." And MacLeod said, "Well, you give me Finlay Goineach, the trickster, to improve the castle." Oh, Maclean said, "You'll get that, MacLeod." And then Maclean drank MacLeod's health, saying, "A favour from you, MacLeod." And MacLeod said, "You're welcome, with a gift." And Maclean said, "What I want is to send Finlay Goineach back to me." And MacLeod said, "I'll do that when the castle's all finished and tidied up and decorated." So this sort of language and tricks carries on. So what's obvious is the value that they were putting on tradesmen, such as joiners, in those times, because Finlay himself was eating and drinking along with these toffs. So once Maclean and the MacLeods are all gathered together and drinking, and the bottles in Finlay's hand, there's a poor woman comes in. So he gives her a dram and he says, "Well, the rest of these toffs can do what they like, but I'm going to give you a calf." And when the nobles heard that, they didn't like to be behind in Finlay with generosity. So all of them, each and every one of them said, "I'll give a calf to the poor woman as well." So therefore, the poor wife, she got 9 calves altogether. Now this surprised Maclean. He said, "Why are you giving the only cow you've got to that old woman and leaving your own wife empty-handed?" And Finlay answered, "That's my own wife. I took her with me to Skye, hidden in a barrel, and now we are 9 times wealthier." Now to something different. So this is a story about Machgilliaglash that was in Gort, and Machgillehenich, I think that would be Shaw in English, from Dewar. There were two men, they were neighbours of each other, living in Gort in Tiree, and they were friends working together. And there was a big moor behind Gort, and the people of the island lived in Scarinish and Gort. They got the peat for fuel for their hearths. So although there wasn't a wood growing in the island at that time, apparently there was once, because there were big trunks of tree roots in the moor, and the people liked them for firewood. So one day, Machgilliaglash and Machgillehenich, the neighbours, they were up at the peat, and they fell out about these trunks. And Machgilliaglash killed Machgillehenich. Now, Machgillehenich was from the island of Dewar, and his friends lived in Dewar, his relatives. So Machgilliaglash expected that there would be a hunt come from Dewar for him to avenge Machgillehenich. So at that time there was no lawmen in the Gaelic, and if any harm was done to anybody, it was his own family that would avenge the affront. And Machgilliaglash wasn't afraid of officers or sheriff, as long as he could keep these Shehanich from Dewar away. So he kept an eye on the sea between himself and Dewar. And one day he saw a boat coming on the way over from Dewar, and he realised that it was a boat coming for him to avenge Machgillehenich's death. And he went to the harbour of Scarinish, where he expected the boat would come ashore, and he lay down in the rocks on the shore. Now, what happens that Machgilliaglash welcomes the Dewar men, and he promises he'd show them where Machgilliaglash's house was, and that was his own house in Gort, where they could go in and kill him. So he guides them to a hollow in the moor between Scarinish and Gort, where he leaves them, and his last words are, the Shehanich lay in the hollow and Machgilliaglash left. And there's no more. That's it. He hasn't finished the story, so we'll never know what happened. Unless if you know it, of course. So the horse that was drowned in the mill lade, the mill stream. So Machgilleinian MacLennan, who was a miller at Ballavulin at Ballanoa, Lachlan Fune lived in Hainish, and Fune's filly was smothered when it fell into the mill lade. So Fune took Machgilleinian to a place that they called Bach na Croiche, and he hanged him. And the miller's sister came to see him, and she said, it's a rhyme in Gaelic, son of the man of Milltown, that should have a kiln and a quern and a mill. On this hill, you got no respect. And then underneath that, he's written Machgilleinian and Loch Allian and Cahpal as well. I know, so that's place names, but Ronnie doesn't know where Loch Allian and Cahpal is, and he hopes that maybe somebody out there can tell him where it is. So you've noticed that there are, in the Gaelic, Dewar has two separate names for the man who hanged the miller, Lachlan Fune and Mach Fune. But this is just a note, this story. But this is the same story again, but with somebody else's name, somebody else named as the man who hanged the miller. Somebody called Ian Mór Dúrach, that's big Ian from Dewar. And we're going to hear more about Ian Mór Dúrach. He was a MacLean from Dewar, and the north end of Dewar belonged to the MacLeans, and it was a wild, far-off country. So this is the first of Dewar. There was a miller at Soraba, and he made a dam for his mill, and there was a ditch at the end of the dam, and there was a peat road that Ian Dewar Moore had over the ditch. And one day, Ian Dewar Moore put his servant boy with horses and creels to take peat home. The boy had 5 horses, and each horse was tied to the horse in front of it, and they're in a line. So when the boy filled the creels, he went home with the horses. And according to the customs of the time, the boy had the halter in his hand, and he led them. And when they reached the ditch at the mill dam, there was a bridge over the ditch for the local people to get over, but it was too narrow for horses. And the horse, the final tail end horse, fell off the bridge into the ditch, and the horse was drowned. So Ian Dewar hangs the miller in front of Tiree, and MacLean was at home in the castle at the time, and when he gets up in the morning, he sees the miller's body on the gallows, and he's angry with Ian Dewar, and he says, instead of hanging my miller, what about the the Irish earl that hit me and knocked my teeth out? So Ian Dewar goes to Ireland, and he stays for a while in the earl's house, and when he gets the chance, he beheads the earl. And then he goes back to Tiree, and he takes the head with him to MacLean, and he says, better the likes of you as a friend than an enemy. And for a reward, I'll give you Ballavarton as long as you live free of rent. And the name of the story tellers there. So here's another hero who's a Tiree man, and it's a lot more civilized, if you like. Donald Coolish, Donald, who lived at Coolish. So there was a man called Donald Coolish who lived at the Narrows between Tiree and Call. He was a son of Neil McKinnon's, they called Neil the Foolish, Neil of the Narrows, and they called him Black Donald, son of Neil of the Narrows. So Dalton, Black Donald, was a farmer for MacLean of Dewar, but he knew all about the sea and boats and how to sail them, and he was an excellent skipper in a rough sea. And he was a farmer in a farm that they call Coolwist. So Ronnie thinks this might have been an English name that Dewar needed here, but there's just Coolwist here. Anyway, Neil McKinnon was an excellent skipper. He had 6 sons, and they were all hardy. And Neil was 6 years without paying rent to MacLean, and there was no law in Scotland then but the chief's will, and MacLean, it was a habit of MacLean to hang 1 or 2 every year. This is a long story. Neil of the Narrows refuses to pay rent. MacLean sends his officers to the Narrows and to take away Neil's cattle. So they take him, Neil takes them back. MacLean orders Neil and his family to be taken prisoner. But when the officer goes there, there's only Dalton, So he's taken a prisoner and he's taken in a boat over to Mull. And MacLean and his daughter's on the same boat, but there's a storm gets up. And since he's such a good mariner, Donald saves him. But when they reach Dewar, 3 of MacLean's men tie him up with a rope and leave him in the boat, and the boat's damaged and he's left on the shore. So MacLean's servant manages to save him, and the result is MacLean hangs the 3 men that left him there and asks Donald what he would like. Would he prefer to stay in Mull to work for Dewar or go home? And Donald looks at the 3 bodies on the gallows and he says, I'd rather go home to cool this. So that's the 7 stories that belong to the MacLean period. So in 1674, the 5-year war started between MacCallan More, the head of the Campbells, and the Lehanich, the MacLeans. And as usual, there's something strange Dewar has that belongs to that very year, and that's the rental of Tiree. And Dewar doesn't say where he got it, but it's valuable. It starts with rental of Tiree, as the same was set by Ewan and Lachlan MacLean by warrant for the deceased Sir Alan MacLean for the year 1674. 3 Mertland, Hinish, probably, possessed by Donald Glass, pays in Scotch money £80 of victual, 120 stone food. Crossable in MacLean's hand, and had thereupon 5 Merkland. Merks was a coin for Halepool, 22 mil land thereof, possessed by tenants and pays in money, £67, 13 shillings and 4pence of victual, 73 stone of butter, 1 pint. And you can see how people paid their rent in food and rather than in money, which was scarce at the time. And so on. And there's 3 other pages of it. So after that, there are 3 tales that belong to these years of disorder in the island after the war. And we'll come across the Laird of Callart, who's a Cameron from Lochaber, Callart's in Lochaber, and then 2 that we meant already, Ian Moore Dúrach, Big Ian from Dura, and Donald Du MacNeil Chulish, Black Donald, son of Neil of the Narrows. But to begin with, the Laird of Callart. Tiree. When MacCallan More, the Campbells, got possession of MacLean's lands, the tenants that MacLean had weren't willing to pay the rent but to MacLean himself. And for 7 years, the Tiree people refused to pay rent to MacCallan, to the Campbells. So it was oatmeal, butter, cheese, and stock that they used to pay instead of money. And that was the same rent that MacCallan wanted. At the end of 7 years, the Laird of Callart went to Tiree with a galley, and he maintained to the Tiree people that he was there on behalf of MacLean. And the Tiree people believed him, and they gave him all the butter and cheese and the oats that they had stored. And when the Laird of Callart got the load aboard the galley, he raised his sails and he sailed away. Now, the Tiree men were regretting that they'd let the Laird of Callart go, and they went after him. But the Cameron got the west wind filling up his sails, and he escaped. And as Dewar says, the Tiree men were terribly angry. But there's another version of the story which is very short, and it's the Laird of Callart and the big Dewar man. So when the Laird of Callart came to Tiree to pick up the rent, the people refused to pay. So the Laird of Callart went away with the stock and to take them out of the island. So the big Dewar man went after him in Dewrach Moor, and he caught up with him at Roig, and he took the stock back from him, and he returned it to the people it belonged to. And it's got a name there, Angus MacArthur Balafoy. So this is the first time that was the name of the storyteller, but it's not the final. So I'll say something about the storytellers at the end. Now, here's Donald Du MacNeill, the Black Donald, son of Neil of the Narrows. After Macallan Moor had got hold of the land that Maclean had, so it was the same tenantry stayed on in the land, but some of the tenantry preferred to pay their rent to Maclean, and others were happy enough with the change in lairdship. So there's one time that Duke Ian, the second Duke that was in Argyll, and two other nobles were going over the Narrows between Coll and Tiree, and there's a gust of wind that toppled the boat, overturned the boat, and the Duke and the other two nobility and the crew were in danger of being drowned at a place that they called Buntu. So two boats went out to help them, and the wind was blowing really strongly, and the sea was rough, and the crew that were in the boats were able to help them. So Daldu saves the Duke, and the Duke gives him coolers free from rent to have, and his descendants after him. And as you can see here, at the end of the story, son of Angus of the Doon, that's Campbell of Dunstaffnish, he was made factor in Ireland, and this happened in 1749. When he asked for claimed rent from Daldu, Donald said, "I've got this place free from rent from Duke Ian." And Campbell of Dunstaffnish said, "Well, where's your charter?" And Donald couldn't show him the charter, and Dunstaffnish made him pay the rent, and ever after that he had to pay the rent. And after that, we have the name of the storyteller, Mrs. Kennedy, in Kilmalloy. I wonder who she was. Now, more about Ian Dewar, Dewar Ian. The story of Big Dewar Ian. There was one of the Macleans in Ballyvarton in Tiree, but he was from Dewar, and they called him Ian Moore Dewar, Big Dewar Ian. So Maclean's Castle Inn was in a little lochan at Ballyvarton, and so Ian Moore Dewar was married to Maclean's daughter. Maclean gave him the care of the castle to look after, and he said, "You keep this castle for me until I come back, whenever I come back." So Maclean went off, and Ian Moore Dewar took care of the castle. And who appears but the red-haired Duke Ian, and his boys started to fire at Tynelling, the castle, with a cannon, and they knocked down the corner of the castle wall. And Ian Dewar says to the Duke, "Oh, a curse on Maclean that he didn't leave me gunpowder and bullets. If I had plenty of them, I'd make your nose bloody before you would get in. You'll never get rent for Ballyvarton. And if I had any more, you wouldn't get that either." And we've got the name of the storyteller, Donald Maclean Ballyvarton, at the bottom of the page. So this is obviously the same D. MacL that we met earlier on. Now, this is apparently something that happened or could have happened in the war 25 years before Ian Ruag, the Red John, was a duke. So it's sort of folklore. There'll be some sort of truth in it, but the story's attached to the wrong man, somebody who left a big mark on the history in the memory of the people. So this is where it's useful to look at other versions of the tale. And there's another version of it in the traditions about the island of Tiree. And this is in English: at long last Argyll did come and laid siege to Island House, and knowing well that the island would soon be his own, he did not want to destroy the house, but waited patiently till the want of provisions would force John Dewar to surrender and give up possession of his stronghold. There's no doubt but there was plenty of firing with small arms on both sides, and windows and doors broken, but the walls was not much injured. And Dewar fired from the windows as long as he was able to hold out. But as MacLean was not coming, he saw it was no use holding out any longer, as their provisions were exhausted and no aid coming to continue the siege any longer. Argyll told him he would set fire to the house if he didn't surrender. At last he gave in, but was so stubborn that he would not come out to deliver the keys, but put them in a blunderbuss and fired them out to Argyll from a window. This ended the siege of Island House, Tyree, Argyll letting everyone go peacefully to his home on condition they would be loyal to him and his successors for the future. The rents was to be paid to him in place of MacLean. After Tiree was in Argyll's possession for some time, MacLean came to an agreement with Argyll and gave up all of the island of Tiree, but the latter, being generous, allowed MacLean a township called Ballyvoulin for many a year afterwards, now the siege being over and all things settled. Now, isn't it strange how the anonymous writer left this double gap for Ballyvoulin, as if he was going to write it as two words in Gaelic, Ballyvoulin, mill town. Anyway, as we thought, the story in D6 is wrong. When Ian Dewar was protecting the Tyree against Argyll, it was the 9th Earl that was there in the War of the 5 Years, and not the second Duke, who was born after that war was over. Now, the story in D6 carries on. The Duke sends Ian Campbell, Black Ian Campbell, to Tiree to pick up the Ballyvarton rent from her friend, Ian Dewar, the big Dewar man. But they're both good swordsmen, and the fight, and Ian Dewar wins, but he spares the Campbell's life. But the Campbells steal his horses in the night and take them away to Inveraray. And when the Duke hears what happened, he's black affronted. So he sends the horses back to Tiree. And then he himself comes to the island and he makes an agreement with Ian Dewar, the big Dewar man. So the next story starts with a sort of précis. Story of Tiree. MacRae challenging Tiree. Banyach, the bailey, the factor, looking for Callum the clerk. Callum lets on that he's got a sore belly. Donald MacDougall is chosen. MacDougall wins and Callum gives him an invitation. Now, here's the proper story. This is just notes that were there. In the old times, there was a habit in Scotland that strong men who were good at wrestling would go from place to place and find somebody that would fight with them. And if they didn't find somebody, then you would need to give them a prize, an reward. So at the time, the Laird of Arrochar was the factor in Tiree, and one of the MacRae clan came from the north, and he asked round about Tiree looking for somebody to fight with. And the Laird of Arrochar was ashamed that nobody would fight him. But at this time, there's somebody called Callum Clairach living at a place called Beist. Now, history doesn't tell us anything about MacRae, but it tells a lot about the Campbell of Arrochar and about Callum Clairach or Clark. So I've written about both of them in my book, The Secret Island, Towards the History of Tiree, and again in The Campbells of the Ark, where there's a full chapter given over to Gillespie Campbell, the Laird of Arrochar, who was in the island through most of the years from 1710 till the year of his death, 1751. And this Callum Clairach, Callum the Clark, left a big mark on the history and folklore of the island, and apparently had particular talents and benefits accordingly. According to folklore, he used to get the hide and the head of every cow that was killed in Tiree as a reward. And there's evidence written in history that he got a herring from every creel that the island people caught as well as a reward. So he refuses to go and fight with MacRae, and he was maintaining he had a sore belly. So the land officer, somebody McKinnon, advised the Laird of Arrochar that there was nothing at all wrong with Callum Clairach, just it was afraid that MacRae would beat him. So McKinnon, the land officer, recommends this other fella, Donald MacDougall in Scarinish, to take his place. So MacDougall beats MacRae, and Callum Clairach invites him to a feast. Callum had 3 sons, and instead of giving MacDougall food and drink, Callum puts the sons out to fight with him, one after the other, but MacDougall manages them all. And then when Callum sees that, he pulls out his dagger, his dirk, to attack him. But the Laird of Kirkapple was watching from behind a hill, and he shouts out, "You hold back your hand, Callum, I'm watching." And Callum looks at him and he stops, and then he tries every trick he has to overcome MacDougall, but eventually the fight, and MacDougall gets the upper hand, and Callum Clairach loses all the respect that he had, and at the end of the story he has to leave the island, and he goes to Ireland. And we know that Callum was in the island till 1729. No. This Laird of Arrochar was the factor. So the Duke of Argyll put Ian Campbell from Arrochar to be a shenachal, to pick up the rents. So Dewar means the old word seneschal, which is just a factor anyway. But he's got the name of the man wrong, because it wasn't Ian he was called, but Gillespie, which is sometimes anglicised as Archibald. So the Laird of Arrochar went to live in a place called Gorchantal, and he was a really good swordsman, and he thought he would be able to oppress the people. But the Tiree people took a spite to him, and they decided to kill him. And they set a time to gather together to do it. And there was a man that they called Donald of the Stream. His name was Donald McKinnon, and he lived in a town called Hoch. And when he'd heard that the Tiree men were about to kill this Laird of Arrochar, he went during the night where he was, and he said to him, "There's a group of Tiree men intending to kill you." Excuse me. And that's the end of the story as we have it here. So this Dáil through takes the Campbell as far as the Narrows, the Coolers, where this other fella hides him in the flue of the corn drying kiln to dry the corn before they could grind it. So these people, the Tiree men, come to look for him. They go through the houses and they're looking for him, but they don't look in the kiln. And it finishes off when night came. Callum Dewar put the laird of Barnacarrig, the factor, over the straits to call, and he took the road he wanted after that. And when he came back to Tiree, he came back with soldiers. So we've got the name of the storyteller, young Ian MacArthur of Moss. And I'm going to say something about young Ian at the end. So we don't know about the flue of the corn drying kiln, but this factor, Barnacarrig, was thrown out of the island this way in 1745 when he came to raise a militia to fight against Prince Charles. So we've got a string of letters that tells how things were, but as you can see, there are two other tales about Barnacarrig. According to the first one, when he heard that there was a group of Tiree men coming to kill him, to murder him, he fled. And the wind came against him and he had to return. And there was this fella, big Arrochar Machilevona. He was standing on a hill and he saw him and he went to help him. And he went with him to Coolus and he spent the night with him there. And when he came back, he had soldiers with him. And according to the second version, the people refused, the tenants refused to pay the rent to Barnacarrig. They came together in a court and they refused to pay. And the factor said to Machilevona, who was the ground officer, the people are refusing to pay. And he said, Machilevona said, they have to pay. And there was a farmer inside and he went out and the officer went out after him and he knocked him down and he took the rent out of his pocket and he went back in and the rest paid. So that's three stories about Barnacarrig, the factor. Twice it's not told us why they were so far against him, but the third time it was that they weren't paying their rent. But there's written history that tells us that it wasn't that at all, and that they were refusing to join the militia against Prince Charles. So I reached the conclusion in the Campbells of the Ark. I take the view that by the 1860s, the loyalties of the people of Tiree had changed so radically that it was now shameful to admit to having refused to fight for the British government.
Oh my goodness.
Anyway, at the bottom of the page, there's Mun Hianish. This isn't, can you see it? Very bottom. It's not the name of a storyteller, this, but a sort of explanation of the name of the officer that was in the tale. We know that Arrochar Machilevona, Arrochar Mun, had an attack over Hianish, or maybe it's Hainish, I don't know, from 1738. In 1748, the factor was ordered to put Machilevona back in his position because he didn't explain why he'd given him the boot. And Machilevona was still in his position as an officer in 1759, 8 years after Barnacarrig, the factor, had died. So that's how the connections between his written history and folklore. We've got another technical hitch there, folks. So as we saw already, it's not just tales that Dewar got in Tiree. He got oceanic lays. They were still being sung commonly throughout Argyll, and Dewar collected a lot of them. He just looked at them like history in a different form. And the one funny thing is that he collected the same lay, Cawn Mac an Deireadh, 4 times in Tiree in different versions. As you can see, it starts, and that's it there. And it means the story of Cawn, son of Deireadh, filled with great anger, going to avenge his father without guile on the nobles and gentry of the Féin, Finn MacCool's soldiers. But that's enough. I'm not going to talk about the lay itself, but what Dewar says at the beginning. I got this song from John MacDonald in Ballyfoyle in Tiree and Neil McKinnon in Drumbuie in Tiree, and a small number of the verses from Duncan Cameron, who was again an officer in Tiree. Now, this is a real lesson on how Dewar worked, his way of working. So he writes this in D10, one of the manuscripts where he drew his notes together. And he mentions 3 people, John MacDonald, Neil McKinnon, and Duncan Cameron. And it's no surprise then that there are 3 versions of the lay in D7, one of his pocket books. So here's more or less the same thing, but Cawn Mac an Deireadh, same. Irrelianagly Traumerics, the same. Going to revenge his father, and it's just the last line's different on the great boundaries of Ireland. And see how it finishes with the name John MacDonald Ballyfoyle. And there's another version that starts after 2 pages in exactly the same words again. But there's no name of the singer with this version or the next version again. But it's different, the next version, and it's shorter. And there's only 4 pages instead of 6 or 7. So this must be the version that Dewar got from Duncan Cameron, the one that only gave him a small number of the verses, as he said. So we managed to put the name of a singer managed to identify it with each version of Cawn Mac an Deireadh in D7. So if we go back again, and if we see the names of the Tiree people that gave tales and lays to Dewar, here they are. Angus MacArthur, Ballyfoyle, Mrs. Kennedy, Kelly Maloig, Donald MacLean, Ballybarton, young John MacArthur, Moss, Ian MacDonald, Ballyfoyle, Neil McKinnon, Drumbuie, and Duncan Cameron, the officer, peace officer. And we can add a few names to that from this page on the left. Now, remember that D6 is just a pocket book. We don't know why these names are here. We don't know whether people had tales or lays, etc. And we don't know why he put a line through some of them. But he put a line through Donald MacLean, who had given them 2 tales already, as we saw. So I think that he was that meant that he'd visited them and he'd got the stories from them. So here's some more. Neil MacArthur Roig, Neil MacLean Roig, Neil MacLeod, that's number 10. Gillespie MacLeod, Ballavarton. What names after MacLeod? It's maybe a bad start on Ballavarton. See, oh, he's looking at the writing here on the left. And then then we've got Duncan McFadden. It's number 12, Duncan McFadden and Cooless. Alan MacDonald and Gott. Alan Cameron and Roig. Big Murdo McIntyre and Killichunich. And then you put a line through John. So this man McKinnon, Dale Street, Per John Campbell, 25 Commerce Street, Tradeston, Glasgow. So this is a new, the new name of it is Tradeston Street. So he was just round the corner from John Campbell in Glasgow. So I've got information about 4 of these, of the 16, and it's in my book, The Gaelic Otherworld. As regards number 12, Duncan McFadden, he gave the Loin Mullerstich, that's the lay of the, it's a sort of creature, the Mullerstich, to John Gregerson Campbell. And he, according to information I got from my late friend Neil Brownlee, he was the great-grandfather of the piping brothers, John, Ian and Duncan McFadden of Mull. So there are some there with no lines through. Now, John Gregerson Campbell got the tale how Fionn went to the kingdom of the great men from this number 15, Big Murdo McIntyre, in 1869, round about the time that Dewar was in Ireland. Number 6. Number 7, Duncan Cameron, the policeman in Tiree. So Ian Gregerson Campbell got the same tale at doing the Mullerstich from him, and also the other tale, the story of the healing of the healing of O'Kane's leg. And when Enoch Ely, John Francis Campbell, the other collector, was in the island, he wrote about the Ossianic lays, and he said in 1871 the policeman in Tiree, who's a native of Ardnamurchan, sang and recited a list of 31 poems which he could sing. And Alexander Carmichael wrote about him that much traditional lore of great excellent died with this highly intelligent lorist. Now, according to Neil Brownlee, this policeman was from Lochalan and had been stationed in Tiree for 10 years. Although he'd left Ireland earlier, he was one of the 30 policemen who escorted George Nicholson to Ballafoyle to serve writs, and some of the men who were involved in the 1886 rebellion. Nicholson, the police, had to beat a hasty retreat when the crowd moved against him. But when 250 Marines arrived, arrests were made and 8 appeared before Lord Muir in the High Court in Edinburgh. Duncan Cameron gave evidence at the trial. And Dewar had died, of course, in 1872 before any of this happened. And as regards young Ian MacArthur Moss, I've got his biography. John Francis Campbell wrote, "Yesterday morning, Monday was beautiful. I got a tailor by the name of MacArthur. I wrote 11 tales and the 12th this morning before breakfast. He's known to Neil M. Rowley as Ian Hawke, who had a house in the March between Moss and Barrapop. He had a daughter, Margaret, who was married to Adol McKinnon from Killimaloik. I remember the couple. The following story connects him with the fairies and seems designed to explain lameness, a handicap often associated with tailors." So there was a man, Ian MacArthur, Ian York, young Ian from the Monjoch, Moss, who kept a fairy wife who had a dwelling in Crumagnan Creek. But he found a new lover and he turned his back on the fairy wife. And 2 days after they parted, he was thatching up on the roof when the fairy woman came up behind him and she knocked him off the wall and he broke his leg. And it's said that he never saw her again after that. So the 1881 census finds him aged 44 and unmarried, living at Moss with his brother, and the tailor died on the 3rd of September 1903, aged 74, still unmarried. So one thing stands out about Ian York, and that young Ian, and that's how young he was when he gave the stories to Dewar. He was only about 40. And Duncan Cameron, he wasn't old either, he was only about 55. So the majority of the people from other places that gave Dewar tales were a lot older than that. And many of them had been born before the year 1800. So I think that's a sign of how strong the Gaelic tradition was in Tiree. The young people then, or the middle-aged people then, had these stories. So I'm going to stop there, and I'd welcome any information about who these Tiree people were that helped Dewar. So thank you. And I think there might be questions and answers now, so don't go away.
Do you have time for questions?
Me? Yes.
Yes. Okay. Clever. So, folks,